Welcome to Educational Bedtime, where history slows down and the world becomes quiet. Tonight, we follow the strange foods people ate when survival was the only rule. Tree bark turned into bread, leather boiled into soup, clay shaped into cakes, and cactus fruit turned into sweetness under a ruthless sun. These aren't just stories about hunger. They're stories about endurance, about families, communities, and the quiet strength it takes to make it through one more day. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let's begin. Chapter 1. When Tree Bark Became Bread, the Finnish Famine Foods. Imagine opening your kitchen cupboard and finding nothing inside. No bread, no flour, no rice, no potatoes. Not even a single bean forgotten in the corner. Now imagine that this is not only your cupboard, but every cupboard, in every home, across the entire country. The shops are empty. The fields have failed. The roads are frozen, and winter is coming. A long Finnish winter, dark, silent, merciless with freezing winds, endless nights, and snow that seems to swallow the world whole. What would you eat if there was nothing left? What would you feed your children when their faces grow thinner each day? When their voices become weaker? When hunger stops feeling like pain and starts feeling like emptiness? If you had lived in Finland during the great famines of the past, you might have learned to grind tree bark into flour, to boil lichen into soup, to search the forest floor for anything at all that could keep a human body alive for one more day. Finland, the beautiful land of forests, lakes, and snow, has always been a place where survival demanded strength, patience, and ingenuity. Its winters were never gentle. Temperatures could fall to -30 degrees Celsius. The darkness could linger for endless hours, and the growing season was painfully short. Even in good years, life could be difficult. But during the great famines, especially the devastating famine of 1866 to 1868, that difficulty turned into terror. The disaster came slowly, and then all at once. First, the summers turned cold and wet. Too cold for healthy crops, too wet for the earth to recover. Potatoes, the simple food that so many poor families depended on, began to rot in the ground. What should have been a season of harvest became a season of loss. And when the potatoes failed once, people worried. When they failed again, people became afraid. And when they failed year after year, fear turned into desperation. But the potatoes were only the beginning. The grain crop suffered too, damaged by the same cruel weather, until bread itself became scarce, and then unbearably expensive. For many families in rural Finland, there was no choice left, even when food existed somewhere. It was too far away, or too costly, or already in someone else's hands, and so people watched, helplessly, as their cupboards emptied, as their savings vanished, as their children grew pale and weak. Hunger crept quietly through the country, into villages, into homes, into beds at night, and while the poor searched desperately for anything to eat, the wealthy often continued to dine as usual. A cruel reminder that famine does not always strike everyone equally. As the normal sources of food disappeared, Finnish families turned to what we now call famine foods. These were not meals anyone wanted, not strange delicacies, not forgotten recipes brought out for tradition. They were emergency food, survival food, the last fragile barrier between life and death. The most famous of them all was bark bread, or petuleipä in Finnish. To modern ears, it sounds unbelievable, even horrifying. Bread made from tree bark. But in times of famine, disbelief means nothing. When the body is starving, the impossible quickly becomes necessary. For centuries, during the hardest years, Finnish people had learned that the inner bark of certain trees, especially pine, birch, and aspen, could be stripped away, dried, ground, and mixed into something like flour. Not good flour, not comforting flour, not the kind that promised warmth or satisfaction, but enough sometimes to quiet the stomach, enough to trick the body, enough to survive a little longer. And in a land where winter showed no mercy, a little longer could mean everything. Making bark bread was not simple, it was not rustic, it was not comforting, and it was certainly not the kind of bread anyone would choose to make. It was the bread of desperation. Even that desperate food, however, did not come easily. To make bark bread, a family first needed knowledge, the kind of knowledge passed down through hard years, through whispered instructions, through memory, which trees could be used, which ones could not, when to harvest, how to avoid poisoning yourself, how to turn something meant for the forest into something the human body could somehow endure. The bark had to come from healthy trees, usually pine, sometimes birch, sometimes aspen, and it had to be taken at exactly the right moment, late spring, when the sap was rising, when the inner bark was soft enough to remove and rich enough to matter. Too early, and there was too little. Too late, and it became harder, drier, less useful. And when your family was hungry, timing was everything. The outer bark was stripped away first, rough, stubborn, resistant until the pale inner layer was exposed beneath it. Then that inner bark had to be peeled away in long strips, carefully, patiently, as if the tree itself were being skinned, only after enough had been gathered. Only after hours of labor in the forest did the real work begin. The bark had to be dried, sometimes under the weak summer sun, sometimes beside a fire, sometimes wherever there was just enough warmth to keep it from rotting. And that process took time, far too much time, days, sometimes weeks. It had to be turned again and again, watched constantly, protected from damp, from mold, from decay, because if the bark spoiled, then all that effort, all that precious labor was lost. And in famine, loss was not an inconvenience, it was danger. Once the bark was finally dry, it had to be crushed into powder. There were no modern machines, no easy tools, only mortars and pestles, rough stones, worn hands, aching arms, and the endless sound of grinding, grinding, grinding. A family could work for hours, for an amount of powder that still did not look like enough. And even then, the powder itself was not good food. Bark flour alone made terrible bread. It was bitter, heavy, difficult to digest, and stubborn in the stomach. It lacked the softness of grain, the comfort of real flour, the simple promise that bread is supposed to give. So Finnish families tried to improve it in whatever small ways they could. They mixed it with tiny amounts of real flour, if they had any left, stretching precious grain farther and farther until there was almost more tree than bread. Sometimes they added crushed fish bones, ground as finely as possible, to give the mixture a little more strength, a little more calcium, a little more hope. Sometimes they added pine needles too. That may sound strange to us now, but in famine, strange things become ordinary. Pine needles carried vitamin C, something desperately needed when fresh fruits and vegetables had disappeared from daily life. When scurvy crept slowly through weakened bodies, making gums bleed, joints ache, wounds refused to heal, the needles had to be gathered carefully, their waxy coating worked off, then dried and ground. Just like the bark, again and again, more labor, more effort, for food that still barely deserved the name and the final result. It was not golden, not soft, not fragrant. It was dark, dense, dry, and deeply bitter. It carried the taste of resin, of wood, of the forest itself. Survivors would later say it was barely edible. Something chewed more from necessity than from hunger. Something swallowed because there was no other choice. For children, it was often even worse. Their small bodies struggled with it. Their stomachs were weaker. Their mouths tired more easily, and the rough, fibrous bread could sit inside them like a stone. But when the cupboard was empty, when the harvest had failed, when winter waited just outside the door, even terrible bread was still bread. And bark was only the beginning. Because when people are truly starving, they learn to look at the world differently, not as beautiful, not as comforting, but as possible food. And so Finnish families turn to something even stranger, lichen. Those pale, brittle growths clinging to rocks and tree trunks. those crusty shapes that look more like old decorations or scraps of something dead than anything a human being should ever put in their mouth. Yet during the famines, lichen became food too. The most commonly used kinds were known as Iceland moss and reindeer lichen, and though they looked unpromising, they could offer some nourishment if you knew how to prepare them, and if you had the strength to do it, because lichen, like bark, was not ready to eat. It had to be cleaned carefully first, every piece checked for dirt, for debris, for impurities, for anything that might make an already starving person even sicker. Then, it had to be soaked for many long hours, sometimes longer, to draw out the bitter compounds hidden inside. Without that step, the lichen could upset the stomach, or worse, and after soaking, it still was not ready. It had to be boiled for hours and hours until the strange, dry fragments softened, until they broke down into something thick, gelatinous, almost trembling. Something that could be eaten like porridge, or stirred into soup, or stretched into one more meal, if it can still be called a meal. Those who survived on lichen described it as bland, slightly slimy, oddly heavy despite how little satisfaction it gave, but it filled the stomach, at least for a while, and in famine, that was enough to matter. Some families tried to make it more bearable, adding herbs, wild seasonings, anything they could gather, anything that might hide the taste, or make the children swallow without crying. And children often managed lichen better than bark bread. It was softer, easier to chew, less harsh on the body. But still, imagine that being dinner, night after night, a bowl of boiled lichen, while outside the cold pressed against the walls, and the darkness of the Finnish winter seemed to have no end. This was not survival in the heroic way we often imagine it. It was slow, exhausting, humiliating, and frightening. It was the quiet fear of wandering every single day, whether what you found in the forest would be enough. Another famine food came from the marshes, from places most people would avoid, wet, silent, cold places where the ground trembled beneath your feet, and dark water waited just below the reeds. There, growing in swamps and wetlands, were cattails, tall plants, with long green blades and those strange brown heads at the top, thick and cylindrical, almost like sausages, swaying in the wind like silent markers in the mud. To us, they might seem ordinary, just another wild plant by the water. But to starving families, they were something else entirely. They were possibility. Cattails could be eaten in several ways, if you knew what to do with them, if you had the strength to harvest them, and if the cold did not break you first. Their roots were the most valuable part, hidden deep in mud and black water, packed with starch, capable of being turned into a kind of flour. The young shoots could be eaten like vegetables, soft, green, and far more welcome than bark. Even the brown flower heads, those strange tops that looked more decorative than useful, could be processed into a flour rich in protein. But once again, nature did not give up its food easily. To gather cattails, Finnish families had to wade into marshes and swamps, often in freezing weather, often with weak bodies, often already exhausted by hunger. Imagine stepping into cold water, your feet sinking into mud, your clothes growing heavy, your hands numbing in the wind, all for the chance, just the chance, of bringing home something your family could eat. The roots were the prize, but reaching them meant digging through wet soil, pulling at stubborn plants buried deep below the surface, sometimes for hours, and the marsh was not kind. The cold could make a person sick, a slip could lead to injury, and a weakened body did not recover easily. Still people went, because when the cupboard is empty, danger begins to feel acceptable. Once the roots were brought home, they still were not food. Not yet. They had to be cleaned thoroughly, washed again and again, scrubbed free of mud, of decay, of anything that could turn survival into sickness. Then came more work, drying, grinding, washing again, separating the usable starch from the useless fibers, days of labor for a small amount of flour. But compared to bark flour, cattail flour was a blessing. It was milder in taste, more nourishing, less harsh on the stomach. Not delicious, not comforting. Not the kind of food anyone would remember fondly, but better. And in famine, better was everything. Many families mixed cattail flour into their bark bread, trying to make it softer, less bitter, slightly more nourishing. Trying to build something closer to real food, from things never meant to be meals. And sometimes, those small improvements mattered more than we can imagine, because in a season of hunger, a bread that tastes only slightly less terrible can feel like mercy. But the forests, the marshes, and the lakes still had more to offer, and so famine pushed people towards something else, something even stranger: fish bones and fish scales. Finland's countless lakes and rivers meant that fishing never fully disappeared, not even in famine, though it became far harder. A hungry body is weaker, slower, less patient, and proper equipment was not always available. Nets broke, tools wore out, hands trembled. But if a fish was caught, no part of it could be wasted. Not the flesh, not the bones, not even the scales. The bones were carefully collected, cleaned by hand, then dried and ground into powder, using stones, crude tools, or whatever else a family had left. It was exhausting work, messy work, the kind of work people only do when necessity has erased all pride. But bone meal carried something precious: calcium, minerals, small invisible things the body desperately needed, especially when it had been living for weeks or months on bark, lichen, and whatever else the land could reluctantly give. The powder could be stirred into bark bread, mixed into lichen porridge, folded into thin soups. It gave nutrition, but also something else: a faint salty taste, a tiny improvement, almost laughably small to us now. And yet in that world, it may have made a meal slightly easier to swallow. The scales were used too. They required even more preparation, because any scraps of flesh or oil left behind could spoil, and spoilage during famine was dangerous. So the scales were cleaned, dried until brittle, then crushed into a fine powder. To modern minds, this sounds revolting: powdered fish scales in bread, fish bones in porridge. But famine changes the meaning of disgust. When starvation enters a home, people stop asking what is pleasant and start asking only what is possible. And these strange powders, however unpleasant they sound, helped prevent some of the illnesses that so often followed hunger. But desperation did not stop there, because sometimes even fish bones were not enough. And so people turned to something even more unsettling: sawdust. Not as a mistake, not as contamination, but on purpose. Families living near lumber mills sometimes collected sawdust from certain woods, especially birch and pine, and tried to turn it into something like flour. Imagine how desperate a person must be to look at the dust of cut wood and wonder whether it can be eaten. It had to be handled carefully. The sawdust was sifted again and again to remove splinters, sharp fragments, anything that could tear the mouth or gut. Then it was boiled repeatedly, softened, washed, boiled again, in the hope that harmful substances could be reduced. Only after all that could it be mixed with other foods. But sawdust gave almost nothing in return. Very little nourishment, almost no true sustenance, only bulk, only the illusion of more. It helped stretch tiny amounts of real food, made a small meal seem larger, gave an empty stomach something to feel. And sometimes, when there is almost nothing, even the illusion of fullness becomes valuable, though it came with risks. If not prepared properly, it could damage the intestines, cause pain, make an already starving person even weaker. But famine is full of terrible choices. Eat the dangerous thing or eat nothing. And then, from all this bitterness, all this mud, all this grinding and boiling and swallowing of things never meant for human mouths, came one of the rarest gifts of all. Something gentler, something almost sweet. Tree sap. In early spring, when winter finally began to loosen its grip, Finnish families tapped birch trees, cutting them carefully, collecting the pale liquid that rose through them as they woke from dormancy. after months of bark bread, of lichen, of bone powder, of whatever could be scraped together from forest, swamp, and mill. Birch sap must have felt almost miraculous. It was thin, clear, slightly sweet, not enough to end a famine, not enough to feed a village, but enough to remind the starving that the world still contains something gentle. The sap carried sugars, minerals, vitamins, small but vital things, especially for bodies worn down by months of hardship, and after so long surviving on foods that were bitter, fibrous, slimy, dry, to taste even a little sweetness must have felt like a whisper of spring, a sign that winter, however slowly, might not last forever. Collecting birch sap was not as simple as cutting into a tree. It required timing, patience, and knowledge that could not be guessed. You had to know exactly when to do it. Too early, and the tree would give you nothing. Too late, and the sap would be thinner, weaker, less nourishing. And the tree itself had to be treated carefully, because in famine, you could not afford to destroy what might save you again next year. A healthy birch tree meant future sap, future bark, future survival. So the cuts were made with care, small, deliberate, respectful, as if even in desperation. People understood they were asking the forest for mercy. The sap could be drunk fresh, clear, cold, faintly sweet, a rare softness in a world of bitter food. Or it could be boiled down, slowly, patiently, until the water disappeared and something thicker remained, something closer to syrup, something that carried more strength in every drop. Some families even learned to ferment it, turning the sap into a mild drink, one that offered calories, a little warmth, and perhaps, for a brief moment, a dulling of the fear, because fear was always there, at the table, at the stove, in the silence after sunset, in the empty space where food should have been. Birch sap did not last all year. It came only in spring, and only for a short while. But that short while mattered. It arrived at the very moment when winter's stored supplies were almost gone, when bark flour was running low, when lichen had already been eaten again and again, when the body had grown tired of surviving. And so the sap became a kind of fragile bridge between the cruelty of winter and the uncertain promise of spring. But perhaps the saddest part of all this, the part that lingers longest, was what famine food meant for children, because children suffered differently. Their bodies were smaller, more fragile, less able to pull nourishment from bark, from lichen, from boiled roots and bone powder. What an adult could barely survive on, a child might not survive at all. Many Finnish children during the Great Famines grew thin in terrifying ways, their arms and legs narrowing, their faces hollowing, their energy fading, even while their parents did everything they could to keep them alive. And that may be the most painful truth of famine. It is not always a story of neglect or lack of love. Sometimes, it is a story of love failing against hunger. Parents often gave the children whatever little real food remained, the smallest crust of real bread, the last spoon of anything nourishing, and kept the bark bread for themselves. They drank the thin soups, ate the bitter scraps, and watched their children chew slowly, hoping, praying that it would be enough. And when even that was not enough, they tried to make the famine food kinder. They mashed lichen into smoother porridge, trying to remove the texture that children hated, trying to make it easier to swallow. They mixed sawdust flour with whatever traces of honey or sugar they could still find, not enough to make it sweet, only enough to disguise the bitterness for a moment. They told stories during meals, soft stories, distracting stories, anything to keep a child from thinking too much about the taste, or the smell, or the terrible truth that this was dinner again. Imagine that kind of tenderness. A parent smiling gently, while handing a child a bowl of something barely edible, pretending calm, while hunger gnawed at them both. During the worst parts of the Finnish famines, the preparation of famine foods became something larger than one family. It became communal. Neighbors worked together, not because they had abundance, but because hardship is easier to face when it is shared. They gathered bark together, processed lichen together, exchanged warnings, shared techniques, taught one another which plants could be trusted and which mistakes could kill. Women especially became guardians of this knowledge. They learned through necessity, through repetition, through generations of hard seasons, how to turn the forest, the marsh, the tree, the scrap into one more meal. Not a good meal, not a satisfying one, but a survivable one. And those methods, those careful habits, those improvised recipes born from hunger, were passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. Because this knowledge was not folklore in the gentle sense. It was survival knowledge. The kind of knowledge that decides whether a family makes it through the winter or disappears into it. These communal kitchens, if they can be called that, were not only places of food preparation, they were places where people tried to hold themselves together, where they shared stories, songs, quiet conversation, anything that could push back, even slightly, against despair. Because famine does not only attack the body, it attacks the mind. It fills every silence with dread, every morning with uncertainty, every night with the same terrible question: will there be enough tomorrow or not? And so the act of preparing food together, however poor the food, however small the portions, became a defense against hopelessness. To peel bark, to stir lichen, to boil sap, to grind roots, was to keep moving, to keep doing something, to refuse. For one more day, to surrender completely to fear. The knowledge behind all of this was extraordinarily complex. It had not appeared overnight. It had been built over centuries, through previous shortages, through bitter lessons, through generations that had already learned how quickly comfort can vanish in the north. A Finnish grandmother might teach not only how to prepare bark or lichen, but when to gather it, which tree to choose, which plant to avoid, how long to soak, how long to boil, how to store what little could be stored. Every detail mattered, because one mistake could mean sickness, wasted labor, or death. And yet, even all this wisdom, all this inherited resilience, all these skills sharpened by centuries of scarcity, were not enough, not this time, because the famine of 1866 to 1868 was worse than what many had known before. Longer, colder, more merciless. It stretched survival to its limit, and then beyond it. Traditional famine foods helped many families endure, but they could not save everyone. Not when the crop failures came again and again. Not when the suffering lasted too long. Not when there was simply too little nourishment and too much desperation. And so, despite bark bread, despite lichen soup, despite birch sap and cattail roots and all the quiet ingenuity of people refusing to give up, thousands still died. Not because they did not know what to do, not because they did not try hard enough, not because they lacked courage, but because sometimes even courage is not enough against a famine. And that may be the most haunting part of all, to know exactly how to survive and still watch survival slip away. The suffering of famine was not only physical. It lived in the body, yes, but it also settled deep inside the mind, because surviving on bark bread, lichen soup, sawdust flour, and crushed bones did not only weaken the stomach, it changed the way people felt about themselves. Many who survived the famines later spoke of shame, a quiet, lingering shame, not because they had done anything wrong, but because hunger had forced them into a life so desperate that even eating became painful in more ways than one. To eat bark bread was to taste more than bitterness. It was to taste poverty, helplessness, cold, and the slow erosion of dignity. Every bite reminded people of what had been lost. Not just harvests, not just comfort, but the normal rhythm of human life. The ordinary dignity of sitting down to a meal and eating something meant for people, something familiar, something kind. That dignity had been replaced by necessity. And necessity can keep a person alive, but it rarely leaves the spirit untouched. For children, the scars could last even longer. A child who grows up in hunger often carries that hunger forward, even after the famine ends, even after the fields recover, even after real bread returns to the table. Some children who survived became adults who could never bear to waste food, not even the smallest scrap. not even a crust, not even the last spoonful left in a bowl. Where others might see leftovers, they saw danger. They remembered too clearly what emptiness looked like. Others grew attached to plain, safe, familiar foods. Foods that did not surprise them. Foods that did not remind them of those strange and frightening meals of childhood. Because when you have once been forced to eat things that barely seemed like food, your trust in food itself can become fragile. A new dish, an unusual texture, an unfamiliar smell. These things could stir memories that words could not fully explain. The body remembers, even when the mind tries to move on. And yet, alongside the shame, alongside the fear, there was often something else too. Pride, a quiet, stubborn pride, because those who survived had endured something terrible, and they had not simply endured it passively. They had adapted, improvised, learned, shared, worked, suffered, and somehow continued. They had proved, in the harshest possible way, that human beings could be astonishingly resourceful, that determination, knowledge, and sheer will could stretch life farther than anyone might think possible. And so the memory of famine foods did not vanish when the famines ended. It remained in stories, in warnings, in family traditions, in the voices of grandparents recalling what had once been done to survive. These foods became part of Finnish memory, not as cherished recipes, not as beloved dishes, but as testimony, proof of what hunger had demanded, and of what people had managed to endure. What is perhaps most remarkable is that modern science has shown that many of these desperate choices were not foolish at all. They were grounded, careful, intelligent. The inner bark of birch and pine really does contain sugars, minerals, and small amounts of vitamins. Lichen does offer carbohydrates and trace nutrients. Cattail roots are genuinely nourishing, capable of providing real calories, real sustenance. In other words, the people who turned to these strange foods were not simply guessing in panic. They were drawing on generations of observation, trial, error, and memory. They had no laboratories, no nutrition textbooks, no scientific instruments, and yet, through centuries of hardship, they had learned which parts of the land could keep a human being alive, not perfectly, not comfortably, not forever, but long enough, sometimes, to survive another winter, another week, another day. Their choices were not random. They were the result of hard-earned knowledge, knowledge paid for over generations, with labor, suffering, and risk, and that is worth pausing over, because it reminds us how fragile our modern comfort truly is. Today, food appears in shops, stacked in bright rows, carried across countries and continents, supported by farms, roads, trucks, warehouses, markets, money, and systems so complex we barely notice them. It all feels normal, solid, guaranteed, until it doesn't. And when those systems fail, through disaster, through economic collapse, through conflict, through bad weather or broken supply lines, human beings are forced back toward something older, simpler, harder, toward survival, and survival, in its rawest form, demands knowledge, creativity, cooperation, and more labor than most comfortable lives can imagine. So as you begin to drift towards sleep tonight, picture those Finnish families. Picture them in the cold northern forests, hands numb in the air, stripping bark from birch trees, carefully, quietly, because failure was too expensive. Picture them inside small cabins with snow gathering outside, while a pot of lichen porridge simmers slowly over the fire. Picture parents pretending calm, giving the larger portion to a child, and keeping the bitter crust for themselves. Picture grandmothers, their hands practiced, their voices steady, teaching which roots to gather, which bark to dry, which plants could save you, and which could kill. This is not only a story about strange foods, not only a curious footnote from history, it is a story about endurance, about the quiet strength of ordinary people, about communities holding together under unbearable strain, about the lengths a mother, a father, a family will go to, simply to keep one another alive. And perhaps that is why the story stays with us, because it reminds us that survival is rarely dramatic, rarely glorious. More often, it is humble, repetitive, bitter, tiring. It is one more bowl, one more day, one more effort, one more small act of love in the face of fear. So the next time you open a cupboard and find it full of ordinary food, bread, pasta, rice, beans, the simple comforts of everyday life, remember those Finnish families who turned tree bark into bread and lichen into soup? Remember that when the world became cruel, they answered with patience, knowledge, and resolve. And remember, too, that human beings can survive far stranger things and far harsher days than we often dare to imagine. Sleep well tonight, and may your own cupboards always remain full, with food softer than bark, warmer than lichen, and kinder than anything famine ever forced upon the living. Chapter 2. Leather Soup and Boiled Belts, the Siege of Leningrad. Picture the most beautiful city you have ever seen. A city of palaces, canals, golden spires, great museums filled with priceless art, broad streets lined with elegant buildings, music drifting through concert halls, poetry, science, culture. Now imagine that same city, silent under snow, surrounded on all sides, cut off from the world, no trains arriving, no wagons of food, no roads out, no escape, only enemy armies, waiting in the cold, tightening the circle. And inside that circle, nearly 3 million people, hungry, frightened, trapped. Winter is coming, and in Leningrad, winter was never gentle. The temperature falls far below freezing, the daylight fades, the nights stretch long and merciless, and the city begins to starve. What would you eat when the bread is gone? When the shops are empty? When there is no meat, no flour, no oil, no vegetables? When even the cats and dogs vanish from the streets? What would you boil in a pot? When food itself has disappeared? This is the story of the siege of Leningrad, where ordinary people were driven to eat things that seem impossible. Leather soup, wallpaper paste, boiled belts, furniture glue. Not because they wanted to, not because they had lost their minds, but because hunger had left them no gentler choice. Leningrad, the city now known as St. Petersburg, was one of the great treasures of the Soviet Union, built by Peter the Great as Russia's window to Europe. It was a place of extraordinary beauty, of grand architecture, of libraries and theaters, of scholars, musicians, writers, and artists. Its people were proud of it. They lived among beauty, among history, among the belief that civilization itself could be preserved in stone, music, and memory. But in September of 1941, that world began to collapse. The Second World War had already been raging for 2 terrible years when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the vast invasion of the Soviet Union. The German armies moved with terrifying speed, sweeping across fields, towns, and villages, bringing destruction with them. And by early September, Leningrad had been surrounded completely. The roads were cut, the railways severed, the city isolated. No steady supplies could come in, and no easy escape remained for the civilians trapped inside. The ring closed, and with it, a new kind of horror began, because Hitler did not simply want to capture Leningrad. He wanted it erased. He wanted one of Russia's greatest cities destroyed, its people starved, its culture extinguished. In his brutal and twisted vision, if Leningrad died, the spirit of the Soviet Union would die with it. So the shelling began, day after day. Artillery shells fell on streets, factories, homes, public buildings, and beyond the smoke, the German army settled in for a siege. A siege they believed would end only when the city was empty of life. At first, many residents still hoped it would not last long, a few weeks, perhaps. Surely the Soviet army would break through. Surely help would come. Surely a city so important could not simply be abandoned to starvation. So people rationed carefully, but not yet with full terror. The city government issued food cards, small pieces of paper that determined who would eat and how much. Each person was entitled to certain amounts of bread, meat, and other basic supplies. At first it seemed harsh, but survivable for a short emergency, perhaps. But the weeks passed, and then more weeks, and no rescue came. The ring around the city held firm, the shelling continued, and the cold crept closer. Autumn deepened, the sky darkened, the air sharpened, and everyone knew what was coming. A Leningrad winter. Even in times of peace, it was severe. Temperatures could fall to -20, sometimes -30 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that stiffens fingers, freezes pipes, turns breath to smoke, and makes every journey feel dangerous. But in a starving city, that cold became something worse. It was not only winter, it was an accomplice. As the autumn went on, the food situation deteriorated with frightening speed. The bread ration was cut, and then cut again. At first, workers received 500 grams a day, then 400, then 300, and by November 1941, even that had collapsed. Workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day. Children, the elderly, and those not classified as workers received only 125 grams. 125 grams, a piece of bread no larger than a small bun, a sad, fragile portion, light in the hand, gone in moments. That was what many people had for an entire day. Morning, afternoon, night, just that. And even calling it bread was becoming a kind of lie, because real flour was running out. So the bakers began adding whatever they could find, anything that might stretch the dough one day further. Sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake, even birch bark flour. Things never meant to become food, now folded into the city's last loaves. The result was dark, bitter, heavy, a bread that barely resembled bread, a bread that resisted the teeth, sat heavily in the stomach, and reminded the hungry that even their ration was no longer truly food, only a substitute for food, a shadow of it. Still, when you are starving, even shadow food matters. And each day, people faced the same quiet torment. What do you do with your ration when it is all you have? Do you eat it immediately, all at once, just to feel full for a few brief moments, just to stop the shaking in your body, the ache in your mind, the terrible awareness of hunger gnawing at you from the inside? Or do you divide it, saving tiny pieces for later, trying to stretch one miserable portion across an entire day, knowing that every hour will make the next bite harder to resist? Some people ate it all at once. It gave them a brief illusion of relief, a small moment where the stomach stopped screaming. But by evening, there was nothing left, only the long dark hours and the knowledge that tomorrow's bread had not yet come. Others tried to save it. A crumb in the morning, another in the afternoon, a final piece at night. But this demanded immense willpower, the kind of discipline that hunger tries to destroy, to hold food in your hand, to know it is all you have, and to put part of it away for later. That was its own kind of battle. And every day, every single day, the city fought that battle again, as the siege dragged on and even bread became rare. The people of Leningrad were pushed toward choices that would once have seemed unthinkable. Hunger has a way of changing the meaning of ordinary objects. A wall is no longer just a wall. A chair is no longer just a chair. A belt is no longer just something you wear. Everything begins to ask the same terrible question. Can this be eaten? One of the first things many families turned to was wallpaper paste. In those days, wallpaper was fixed to the walls with a simple paste, usually made from flour and water. Under normal circumstances, no one would have thought twice about it. But in a starving city, even the glue behind the wallpaper began to look like food. Families would carefully peel back the paper from their walls, scraping away the dried paste hidden underneath, collecting it into bowls, into cups, into whatever containers they still had. Then they would boil it, not into a proper meal, not into anything nourishing by ordinary standards, but into a thin, sticky soup, a pale, gluey liquid, something warm to swallow, something that offered at least a few calories, something that could quiet the emptiness, if only for a moment. Even this was dangerous. By then, many people were so weak from hunger, so unsteady, so lightheaded, that climbing onto a chair or a stool became a risk. A person might reach too high, lose balance, fall, and in a starving body, even a small fall could become serious. So families worked together. Children held furniture steady. Adults stretched trembling arms upward, scraping paste from the walls little by little, as though peeling food out of the city itself. The soup it made was almost tasteless, with a strange gummy texture, something halfway between broth and glue. But when there is nothing else, taste begins to matter less than survival. And so the walls were stripped. Then came the furniture, because furniture, too, contained something hunger could not ignore. Glue, before synthetic adhesives. Many pieces of furniture were held together with glue made from animal parts. Bones, hooves, hide, boiled down into a sticky substance, then used to bind wood together, which meant, horrifyingly, that the glue still contained traces of protein, traces of nourishment, tiny remnants of the animal it once came from. And so families began to dismantle old furniture, chairs, tables, cabinets, anything worn enough, anything spare enough, anything that could be sacrificed. The glue had to be removed carefully. Some heated furniture near the fire, softening the hardened glue until it could be scraped away with knives, or with any sharp metal they could still manage to hold. Others soaked pieces of wood in water for days, waiting for the glue to loosen, waiting for it to dissolve just enough to collect. It was exhausting work, slow, messy, frustrating work, and it asked so much of people who already had almost nothing left to give. Hands were weak, backs ached, heads spun from hunger. But still they worked, because a few scraps of glue, boiled into soup, might keep a family alive a little longer. A day, perhaps, two if they were lucky, and then desperation deepened even further, towards something even more unsettling. Leather. People began boiling their shoes, their belts, their bags, their gloves, any leather item they could find, because leather had once been skin, animal hide, and if it had once come from a living creature, then perhaps some small part of it could still nourish the living. It was a terrible hope, but famine feeds on terrible hopes. Turning leather into something edible was painfully difficult. First, each item had to be cleaned thoroughly, repeatedly, to remove dirt, polish, dyes, chemicals, anything poisonous that clung to it from its former life as an object. Then it was cut into pieces, small strips, small chunks, whatever could fit into a pot, and then it was boiled for hours and hours and hours, waiting for it to soften, waiting for it to surrender, waiting for something as stubborn as a belt or a shoe sole to become something a human mouth might possibly endure. Sometimes people boiled the same leather again and again, refusing to waste even the smallest chance of nourishment, hoping that one more hour, one more pot of water, might pull out one last trace of life from it. The result was what survivors later called leather soup, a name that sounds almost absurd, until you remember that it was real, and it was awful. The taste was dreadful, harsh, bitter, strange. The texture was worse, chewy, rubbery, gristly, the kind of thing the teeth could barely conquer, the throat could barely accept, and the stomach often could barely tolerate. Many could not keep it down, especially children. Their bodies were too weak, their stomachs too delicate, their hunger too deep to be relieved by something so unnatural. And yet, for some families, even leather soup meant survival, not comfort, not strength, not health, only time, one more day, perhaps one more week. And in Leningrad, time itself had become precious. Even books, even paper, were drawn into this terrible economy of survival. The bindings of books often contained glue, the same kind of animal-based adhesive found in furniture. So people began taking books apart, carefully, reluctantly, separating the bindings, boiling them down, trying to extract a little soup, a little protein, a little something. Even paper itself was sometimes eaten. Not because it nourished, it barely did, but because an empty stomach can be deceived for a moment, filled not with sustenance, but with substance, something to chew, something to swallow, something to occupy the body's panic. And yet, few choices were more heartbreaking than this. Because Leningrad was not just any city, it was a city of readers, of scholars, of music, of libraries, of thought. A city that treasured literature, that believed in culture, that surrounded itself with art and knowledge. To destroy a book, not for warmth, not for shelter, but for food, or something resembling food. That was not only an act of desperation, it was an act of grief. Every torn binding, every scraped spine, every page sacrificed, must have felt like a wound, as though hunger were not merely consuming the body, but also devouring the mind, the memory, the dignity, the very civilization the city had once stood for. And that is one of the cruelest truths of the siege. It did not only force people to suffer, it forced them to betray, little by little, the ordinary meaning of the world around them. Walls became soup, chairs became broth, belts became meals, books became calories. And still, even then, many endured, not because these things were enough, but because human beings will cling to life through methods that seem impossible, through choices that sound unbearable, through one more pot, one more scrape, one more swallow, one more day. Among the strange foods of the siege, there were a few that offered something more than mere bulk, something more than the illusion of fullness. One of these was birch bark, a desperate food, yes, but not an entirely foolish one. Some people in Leningrad still carried fragments of older knowledge, memories passed down from earlier Russian famines, stories of hard times, of trees turned into bread, of forests feeding the starving when fields and markets could not. And so, as hunger deepened, they remembered what others before them had learned, that the inner bark of birch trees, if stripped carefully, dried and ground, could become something like flour, bitter, rough, far from pleasant, but real enough, sometimes, to help keep a person alive. In another world, in another season, gathering bark might have been difficult. In a besieged city, it was dangerous, because the trees were not waiting safely in some distant countryside. They stood in parks, along roads, in open places, places where a person had to leave the thin protection of buildings and step into spaces that might already be watched. And outside, there were snipers, hidden, patient, invisible, the kind of threat that turns even a quiet walk toward a tree into a gamble with death. Still, people went. Families organized bark-gathering trips, small expeditions of hunger and caution, usually at dawn or at dusk, when the light was dim, when outlines blurred, when perhaps the watchers beyond the city would see a little less clearly. They moved quickly, quietly, trying not to draw attention, trying to gather enough bark, enough to stretch the bread, enough to mix into soup, enough to push death back by one more day. Once it was brought home, the work continued indoors. But this was not the countryside of Finland, not open forests, not village hearths. This was Leningrad, a starving city of apartments, cellars, broken stairwells, and dark basements. So the old techniques had to change. Pieces of bark were dried near any heat source people could still manage, beside stoves, near fireplaces, sometimes even near candles. Imagine that, a family huddled in a freezing apartment, guarding a tiny flame, using precious heat not for comfort, but to dry strips of tree bark. Everything had become labor. Everything had become calculation. Once dry, the bark had to be ground with whatever tools could be found. A mortar, a knife handle, a stone, anything strong enough to crush it into powder. And what it produced was not real flour, not the soft white promise of ordinary bread, only something dark, harsh, and bitter. But sometimes that bitterness still meant life. And then, as the siege dragged on, as the city emptied itself of everything edible, another boundary collapsed. Pets, at first. Cats and dogs began disappearing from the streets, then from courtyards, then from homes, and little by little, they were gone. This was not only hunger, it was heartbreak, because these were not nameless animals, not merely creatures wandering the city. They were companions, small comforts in ordinary life, beings that had shared warmth, routine, affection. Families had loved them. Children had named them, fed them, slept beside them. And yet, as starvation tightened its grip, some families were forced into a choice so painful it hardly feels bearable to imagine. Watch a child starve, or sacrifice the animal that child once loved. There are moments in famine when morality is not shattered in some dramatic instant, it is worn down, slowly, by cold, by fear, by the sound of an empty stomach, by the sight of someone you love growing weaker each day. And in those moments, people do what they must and then carry the sorrow of it afterward. The killing and preparation of pets was usually done in secret, quietly, behind closed doors, out of shame, out of grief, and out of fear. Because there was another danger too. If others knew you still had an animal, they might try to steal it. Hunger erodes trust. It makes even neighbors dangerous. So families worked in silence, trying to preserve dignity where almost none remained. They stretched the meat as far as possible, mixing it into thin soups, combining it with scraps of anything else, trying to make one unbearable decision feed a family for several days. But even that was not always enough, and then came things even harder to speak of, what some people called, with grim politeness, meat patties, a gentle name for a desperate reality. These patties were made from rats, from pigeons, from whatever living creatures could still be caught in the city. The idea itself is enough to make most modern people recoil. But hunger leaves little room for disgust. Rats, for all their horror, did contain nourishment, more than wallpaper paste, more than paper, more than boiled leather. But they were difficult to catch, quick, cautious, creatures that had learned to survive in the same ruined city as the humans hunting them, and they carried danger of another kind, disease. Pigeons were easier to trap, but offered very little meat. Still, little by little, people devised methods, improvised traps, bits of string, wire, boxes, whatever materials could still be found. The city had become a place where every corner suggested another question. Could something be caught here? Could something be boiled? Could something be made to last? For many city dwellers, this was alien knowledge. They had not grown up cleaning wild animals, had not learned how to butcher creatures from the street, had never imagined they would need to know. And now they had to learn quickly how to clean the body, which parts might be safe, how long to cook it, how to avoid sickness, how to use as little fuel as possible. Because fuel, too, was fading, and every fire became a decision. Do you use it for warmth or for cooking? Do you save it now or spend it on a meal that may still make you ill? This was the siege in one of its cruelest forms. Not only hunger, but endless impossible choices. And perhaps nowhere was that cruelty felt more deeply than inside the family. Because famine does not strike strangers first. It enters the home. It sits at the table, between parent and child, between husband and wife, between generations. And it forces love into terrible shapes. Parents went days without eating, so their children might have a little more. A larger spoonful, a slightly thicker soup, one more bite of bread, one more chance. Children, in turn, sometimes pretended they were not hungry. Imagine that sadness. A hungry child, trying to smile, trying to say I'm fine, so that a mother or father would suffer a little less guilt. Even the young learned to perform courage, and the elderly. The elderly often understood the arithmetic of hunger better than anyone. They saw the shrinking portions, the hollow faces, the fear in the room, and some of them, quietly, simply stopped eating. Not always with words, not always with announcement, just less and less and less, until it became clear what they were doing, trying to leave more for the young, for the children, for those whose lives still stretched farther into the future. There is something almost unbearable in that image. An old person, already weakened, pushing away a bowl, pretending not to want it, pretending it is enough, when in truth they are making themselves disappear, one missed meal at a time. This is what the siege did. It turned food into sacrifice, love into silence, family into a place of quiet negotiations with death, and still, somehow, people endured. Not untouched, not unbroken, but enduring nonetheless. The effects of these desperate foods were not only physical, they were psychological too. Deeply, painfully, psychological. Because hunger does not merely weaken the body. It changes the mind, the memory, the way a person sees themselves. Many survivors later said they felt as though they were losing something essential, something human. Not only weight, not only strength, but dignity, identity, the sense that they were still living like people and not merely surviving like hunted animals. To drink leather soup, to swallow wallpaper paste, to chew on things that had once belonged to walls, furniture, clothing, books. It did not just fill the stomach, it wounded the spirit. The taste stayed with them. The texture stayed with them. The smell stayed with them. Long after the siege was over, long after bread returned, long after the guns fell silent. A certain odor, a certain sticky texture, a certain boiled heaviness in the air. And suddenly, the years would collapse. They would be back there again, in the freezing apartment, in the dark kitchen, in the silence between shell bursts, holding a spoon over a pot of something that should never have become food. That is one of the cruelest things about survival. Even when the body escapes, part of the mind remains behind. And yet, even in that darkness, there was ingenuity. There was learning, sharing, quiet cooperation. People passed information to one another, carefully, discreetly, like little pieces of life, which glues were safe, which materials were dangerous, how to soften leather, how to make birch bark a little less harsh on the stomach, how long to boil, how much to scrape, what to avoid. Neighbors exchanged these things in whispers, in stairwells, in kitchens, in conversations shaped by exhaustion and necessity. There was no grand system, no official handbook for how to eat a city, only an informal network of survival. One family learning by bitter experience, then passing that knowledge on, so another family might suffer a little less, or survive a little longer. And that knowledge mattered, because in the siege, information itself became nourishment. At the same time, hunger transformed value. It rearranged the meaning of wealth. A city that had once treasured elegance, culture, beauty, was forced into a different economy, a black market of desperation. There, unusual things became precious. A little real flour, a leather item that could be boiled, a scrap of animal glue, even a rumor about where edible materials might still be found. These could be worth more than objects that once seemed priceless. A family heirloom, a piece of jewelry, a rare book, a cherished painting. All could be traded away for a few days of food, or for something that resembled food closely enough to keep death waiting. Imagine that inversion. A pair of old boots, cracked and worn, more valuable than a beautiful work of art, because the boots could become soup, and the painting, however exquisite, could not be eaten. That is what famine does. It strips the world down to its most brutal logic. Not what is beautiful, not what is meaningful, not what is treasured, only what sustains life, and for how long. Even the doctors watched this transformation with horror. Medical professionals in the city saw what these diets were doing. Yes, foods like leather soup and wallpaper paste could provide a few calories, a little bulk, a temporary feeling of fullness, but they were not real nourishment, not complete, not sufficient. And often, they caused harm of their own. The body of a starving person is already weak, already consuming itself. Its stomach slows, its organs strain, its strength fades. To ask such a body to digest boiled leather, glue, sawdust, paper, sometimes the effort cost more energy than the food gave back. A cruel exchange, to eat and still grow weaker. Children suffered most of all, they always do. Their smaller bodies needed proper food, real proteins, real fats, vitamins, minerals. They were growing, or meant to be. But sawdust bread could not build a child, and leather soup could not nourish one properly. Many children who survived the siege carried its damage for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Their bodies had endured hunger during the very years when they should have been growing strong, and some never fully recovered from that theft. Yet even in all this, even in starvation, even in grief, even in cold so sharp it felt alive, the people of Leningrad did not surrender. That may be one of the most astonishing truths of all. The siege lasted 872 days, nearly 2.5 years, 2.5 years of hunger, of artillery fire, of cold, of waiting, of waking each morning into the same exhausted nightmare. And still the city continued. Factories kept working, essential services struggled on, people reported for duty, streets were cleared when possible. The machinery of life, however broken, still moved, and more than that, the city tried to preserve its soul. Musicians performed concerts, teachers kept lessons going whenever they could. Artists recorded what they saw, what they felt, what they feared might otherwise vanish into silence, even under siege. Leningrad refused to become only a place of death. It insisted, somehow, on remaining a place of culture, of memory, of human meaning. And perhaps that refusal was its own form of resistance. The siege finally ended in January 1944, when Soviet forces broke through the German lines and secure supply routes were restored. But by then, the cost was beyond staggering. More than 1 million residents of Leningrad are believed to have died, most from starvation or from illnesses made inevitable by malnutrition and weakness. More than 1 million. It is such a large number that the mind almost resists it. So many lives ended not in battle, but in kitchens, in stairwells, in unheated rooms, in beds where the body simply no longer had enough left to continue. Those who survived had endured one of the harshest ordeals human beings have ever faced, and their story remains as a testament to resilience, yes, but also as a warning. Because the survival foods of Leningrad tell us two things at once. They show us how inventive human beings can be, how resourceful, how determined, how people will find calories in wallpaper paste, protein in glue, hope in birch bark, and one more day of life in a boiled leather belt. They will learn, adapt, teach one another, and endure more than seems possible. But the story also reveals the terrible cost of such endurance. These foods kept some people alive, but only barely. They were never enough for health, never enough for strength, never enough to spare the body from damage or the mind from trauma. The survivors carried those years inside them, in weakened health, in haunted memories, in the grief of what they had seen and what they had been forced to become in order to live. So as you begin to settle into sleep tonight, think of those families in Leningrad, carefully scraping wallpaper paste from the walls, trying not to spill a single bit. Think of belts boiling in pots while artillery thundered outside. Think of parents handing the larger piece of bread to a child, then saying they were not hungry, even when they were starving. Think of neighbors sharing small secrets of survival. How to soften bark, how to extract glue, how to stretch one terrible meal into two. Their story reminds us that food security is fragile, far more fragile than it sometimes seems. That the ordinary comfort of a normal meal, bread that is truly bread, soup made from ingredients meant to nourish, a table where no one must pretend not to be hungry. These are not small things. They are blessings, and their story also reminds us of something else. That war does not only destroy cities with bombs and shells, it destroys them slowly too, through hunger, through cold, through the quiet corrosion of daily life, through the long humiliation of turning the world itself into food. So the next time you sit down before a simple meal, something warm, something ordinary, something kind, remember the people of Leningrad, remember the hands that scraped paste from walls, the belts lowered into boiling water, the books dismantled for glue, the families who endured the unimaginable, not because they wanted to, but because life still called to them, even from inside that darkness. Sleep gently tonight, and may your own meals always be softer, fuller, and far more merciful than leather soup ever was. Chapter 3. Clay Cakes and Grass Soup, the Irish Potato Famine. Imagine living in a place where almost everything depends on a single crop. Not one food among many, not a comfort, not a luxury, but the thing that stands between your family and hunger, the thing that fills the pot, the plate, the stomach, the thing you eat in the morning, and again at night, day after day, year after year. Now imagine what happens when that one crop begins to die, not in some distant region, not in someone else's field, but everywhere, all at once. The plants that should be green and healthy suddenly blacken, collapse, rot where they stand. The air fills with a smell so foul, so unnatural, that people say it smells like death itself. And when you dig into the earth, hoping, praying, that perhaps something below has survived, you find only black mush, soft, ruined, poisoned. This is the story of the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. A catastrophe so deep, so prolonged, that people turned to things barely imaginable. Clay mixed with milk, soup made from grass and weeds, seaweed dragged from the shore. Anything at all, that might quiet the hunger, that might keep a child alive, that might carry a family through one more day. To understand why this famine became so devastating, you first have to understand how completely the potato had taken hold of life in Ireland. For many Irish families, especially the poor, the potato was not merely important, it was everything, not part of the diet, breakfast, dinner, supper, sometimes nothing else. A little milk, perhaps, a little buttermilk, if fortune allowed. But often the meal was potatoes, and then potatoes again. A man might eat 10 pounds in a day, sometimes 15. A woman, 8, perhaps 10, even children, small bodies with constant hunger, would eat several pounds daily. To us, this might sound impossible, or unhealthy, or bleak. But potatoes are more generous than they appear. They carry vitamin C, they offer carbohydrates, they contain enough nourishment when eaten in quantity to sustain human life surprisingly well. And so for generations, this fragile arrangement held, poor, monotonous, but workable until suddenly it did not. In 1845, the blight arrived. No one at the time understood what it was. No one knew the name Phytophthora infestans. No one could explain why healthy-looking fields became fields of ruin almost overnight. One day the leaves stood green, alive, promising. The next, they darkened, blackened, withered, and began to rot. The smell was unforgettable, a sickening smell, heavy in the air, sweet and foul at once, like damp soil, decay, and something far worse. Families went out to the fields anyway. What else could they do? They dug into the earth with hope already fading, hoping some part of the harvest had been spared. But the potatoes below were no salvation. Only black, mushy masses, inedible, corrupted, useless. The first year was terrible, but many still tried to believe it was only a bad season, a misfortune, a single blow. Surely the next harvest would recover. Surely this could not happen again. But it did. The blight returned in 1846, and again, into 1847, into 1848. Year after year, the same terrible pattern repeated itself. Fields would appear healthy, and then fall into ruin. Whole communities watched their only true food source disappear, not once, but over and over. Hope itself began to rot, and as the famine deepened, as food disappeared from homes and markets, families were pushed toward things that once would have seemed unthinkable. One of the most common was what people called grass soup. The name sounds simple enough, almost harmless, but there was nothing harmless about it. This was not soup with herbs in it, not some rustic broth flavored with wild greens. For many families, grass and weeds became the meal itself. The field became the kitchen. The ditch became the pantry. People gathered what they could find, whatever grew freely, whatever had not yet been eaten by others, whatever looked as though it might not kill them, because that was the first problem. Not every green thing is food. Some grasses are useless. Some weeds are bitter beyond swallowing, some plants are poisonous, and many starving families did not already possess the knowledge to tell them apart. So they learned the cruelest way possible, through guesswork, through rumor, through testing small amounts, through sickness, and children were especially vulnerable, small bodies weakened already by hunger, more easily harmed by the wrong plant, more quickly broken by it. Even gathering the plants was hard and dangerous. People spent hours walking through fields, hedgerows, woods, searching, bending down again and again, pulling handfuls of whatever the land would give. But this too came with risk. Landlords might punish tenants for trespassing. The weak could become lost, or fall, or simply not have the strength to make it home again. Hunger makes even walking dangerous. Still, people went, because an empty pot demands something. And once enough greens had been collected, the work continued. Families boiled them for hours, hoping to soften the fibers, hoping to draw out bitterness, hoping to make them safer, hoping to turn something wild and uncertain into something a human body could endure. What emerged was hardly comforting, a thin soup, watery, bitter, hard to swallow, harder still to keep down. It did contain something, a few vitamins, a few minerals, small traces of what the body needs, but nowhere near enough. Not for long, not to truly live on. Many who depended heavily on grass soup grew terribly ill. Their stomachs rebelled, their bodies weakened further, and some became sicker from the soup than from hunger alone. And then came something stranger still, clay. In the hardest moments of the famine, some people began to eat earth itself, not by accident, not as madness, but as method. There were ways of doing it, rituals, techniques. The most common was to take white clay, mix it with milk or buttermilk, and shape it into what became known as clay cakes, a bleak imitation of bread, something that could be held, divided, chewed, something that resembled food, even if it was not truly food at all to modern ears. It sounds impossible, almost unbelievable, but there was a grim logic behind it. Some kinds of clay do contain minerals, and clay can fill the stomach, or at least make it feel less empty for a while. It can dull the sharpness of hunger, quiet the body's panic, create the illusion that something substantial has been eaten. And this was not a wholly invented practice. Other cultures, too, in other hard times, had turned to clay as a supplement. So the Irish were not descending into pure irrationality. They were reaching, desperately, for anything that had ever helped anyone survive. But clay was dangerous, very dangerous. Most types were not safe for human consumption. They could bring severe pain, digestive distress, intestinal blockages, even death. And so once again, people had to learn through bitter experience which clay was less harmful, which places were believed to have purer deposits, which methods made it slightly safer. Slightly, only slightly. Because clay could never truly nourish the starving. It could only silence the hunger for a moment, and even that silence came at a cost. Still, the practice spread, and the making of clay cakes became, in some homes, a grim domestic ritual. Families searched for pale clay in places they trusted, specific banks, certain patches of earth, locations whispered about from one household to another. They brought it home, cleaned it carefully, picked out stones, dirt, grit, anything that might make it even worse. Then they mixed it, with milk if they had milk, with buttermilk if they were fortunate, or with water when they were not. The mixture was shaped by hand, pressed into little cakes, formed into something that looked, from a distance, almost ordinary. Almost. Then it was dried, stored, set aside like provisions. Imagine that scene, a family in a quiet room, hands shaping earth into food, pretending, perhaps, that the shape itself might make it more bearable, pretending that if it looks enough like bread, it might feel less frightening to eat. But beneath that fragile performance, everyone knew. This was not bread. This was not nourishment. This was desperation, made visible and placed on the table. Children suffered especially. They always do. Their bodies were smaller, more fragile, less able to endure the strange and punishing things famine placed before them. Clay cakes were particularly hard on them. What an adult might force down with pain, a child might choke on or fail to digest at all. Their stomachs could not easily manage something so heavy, so unnatural, so close to inedible, and so, whenever possible, parents ate the clay themselves. They took the harsher portion, the more dangerous portion, and gave whatever real food could still be found, however little, however poor, to their children. But famine is cruel because it narrows choice, and sometimes there was no real food left, no milk, no potato, no bread, nothing that still deserved the name of nourishment. And then entire families sat together, swallowing these desperate substitutes side by side, each trying not to look too closely at the others, each pretending, perhaps, that if everyone ate it, it might feel more bearable. It did not. Another food of desperation came from the sea. As the land failed, as fields yielded less and less, many Irish families turned their eyes toward the coastline. Ireland is a country wrapped in shore, and for those who lived near the sea, the tide itself began to look like a kind of provider, or at least a final possibility. Seaweed became one of the great foods of survival, not because it was beloved, not because it was easy, but because it was there. It washed ashore with the tides, dark, tangled, listening, thrown onto beaches by water that gave and took without mercy. Some kinds of seaweed are genuinely nourishing, rich in minerals, vitamins, even a little protein. And coastal communities already knew some of this. They had seen these plants before, known their uses, heard the old knowledge. But during the famine, what had once been supplementary became essential. The most commonly eaten kind was dulse, a reddish-purple seaweed, soft in places, leathery in others, which could be eaten raw or boiled into soup. Among famine foods, it was one of the kinder ones, still strange, still difficult, but real enough in its nourishment to matter, and so families went to gather it. But even this came with danger, because the sea is never truly generous without asking something in return. To harvest seaweed, people often had to climb over slippery rocks, walk narrow stretches of coast, and work in bitter wind and cold spray, sometimes during storms, sometimes during uncertain weather, sometimes at low tide with the knowledge that the water would soon return. A single misstep could mean injury, a stronger wave than expected, a foot slipping on stone, a body already weakened by hunger losing balance at the wrong moment. And the sea does not care how hungry you are. Still, they went, entire families sometimes, even whole communities, organizing expeditions at low tide, moving together, gathering as much as they could before the water came back, hands cold, clothes soaked, bodies shaking in the wind. But seaweed was free, and when food has vanished from shops, from fields, from cupboards, free becomes precious. Once gathered, it still had to be prepared. Not every inland family knew how. Seaweed had to be cleaned carefully, washed of sand, of salt, of bits of shell and drift and dirt. Some types needed soaking in fresh water to pull out the excess salt that could make a starving person even sicker. Then it could be eaten raw or boiled into soup, or dried and ground into a powder, mixed with whatever else a family still had. Its taste was not easy for everyone. Survivors described it as sharply salty, fishy, with a slippery texture that clung to the mouth. For those unaccustomed to it, it must have felt like swallowing the sea itself. Children struggled with it especially, the texture, the smell, the unfamiliarity. But parents often insisted, because unlike clay, unlike some other desperate substitutes, seaweed carried real nourishment. Not enough to end the famine, not enough to restore strength completely, but enough to matter, enough to justify the struggle, the wet clothes, the dangerous rocks, the swallowing of something the body did not want but needed. Then there were nettles, another gift of hardship, hidden inside pain. Nettles grow wild in much of Ireland, common, stinging, easily overlooked in ordinary times, a plant most people would avoid. But famine teaches a person to look again, to look past the sting, past the instinct to step away, and ask instead, can this feed us? And nettles, properly prepared, could. They were rich in vitamins, minerals, real nourishment by the standards of famine. But collecting them was never pleasant. Their tiny hairs stung the skin, sharp, hot, irritating. A small violence repeated again and again. Families developed ways to gather them, wrapping cloth around their hands, using sticks to knock the plants down, trying whatever methods they could invent, and when they had nothing at all, they sometimes used bare hands. Because hunger often outruns caution, the stings hurt, but only for a while. And pain that fades is easier to accept than hunger that does not. Once harvested, nettles had to be treated carefully. Boiling was the most common answer. The heat neutralized their sting, softened them, turned them from something defensive into something edible, and so nettle soup became another meal of the famine. A real soup, in its way. Not rich, not satisfying, but carrying something the body could use. Its taste was often described as earthy green, a little like spinach. Of all the strange foods famine forced upon people, it was one of the more bearable, one of the less frightening. It could not fill the stomach completely, but it could help protect against some of the diseases that follow malnutrition. And in such times, that too was a blessing. Tree bark entered the story as well, as it had in Finland, as it would in other famines. The trees themselves became part of the kitchen. Irish families learned to strip and process the inner bark of certain trees, especially oak, elm, and birch, turning it into a coarse, flour-like substance, something that might be mixed with other scraps and shaped into something resembling bread. Only resembling, because real bread was becoming a memory. The work was familiar in its hardship. Bark had to be stripped, dried, ground, handled patiently. But Irish families faced their own particular dangers. The trees did not always belong to them. They stood in forests, along roads, on private land, and the famine had not erased power. Landlords still watched, authorities still punished, property still mattered, even while people starved. So gathering bark could become another act shadowed by fear. A family creeping along a roadside, stripping a tree quickly, listening for footsteps, for voices, for the possibility of being caught. Even survival had to be done carefully. Once made, bark flour was mixed with whatever else could be found. A little true flour, if any remained, clay for bulk, even sawdust from mills. All of it pressed together into loaves, cakes, dark, bitter masses that were difficult to chew and harder still to digest. But they sat in the stomach for a while. They gave shape to a meal, or at least the memory of one. And once again, it was the children who suffered most. The sight of children trying to eat these things, grass soup, clay cakes, bitter bark bread, was among the deepest wounds the famine left behind. Their bodies could not draw enough nourishment from such marginal food. Their small stomachs rebelled. Their strength failed faster. Their vulnerability was everywhere visible. Parents gave them everything they could, often nothing to themselves for days. A mother pushing a bowl toward a child. A father pretending not to be hungry. Adults swallowing pain in silence so the young might have one little portion more. And still, for many children, it was not enough. That may be one of the most haunting truths of famine. Love does not disappear. It intensifies, and yet love alone cannot turn clay into bread or weeds into a harvest. Many survivors later remembered above all the sight of children trying to choke down those foods, the grimace after the first swallow, the hesitation before the next, the tears, the weakness, the effort to obey because there was nothing else. These were memories that did not fade easily, and as in so many famines, the making of these desperate foods became communal. Knowledge had to travel from neighbor to neighbor, from one cottage to the next, from those who had learned painfully to those who might still be spared the same mistake. People shared which plants could be eaten, where the best seaweed could be found, which clay seemed least harmful, how long to boil, how long to soak, how to make something terrible, slightly less terrible, Women especially became keepers of this knowledge, through repetition, through care, through necessity. They learned how to soften bitterness, how to stretch a handful into a meal, how to make the barely edible just edible enough, not through luxury, not through craft for pleasure, but through the hard intelligence of survival. And in village after village, these small acts of shared knowledge, these recipes of hunger, became another way communities resisted disappearance. These community kitchens were about more than food, much more. They were not only places where seaweed was washed, or nettles were boiled, or bark was ground into something that might pass, for bread. They were places where people gathered, because gathering itself could become a kind of survival. When hunger enters a village, it does not only empty the stomach, it empties the spirit too. It isolates, it weakens, it makes every family feel as though it is suffering alone, and so these kitchens became something precious. A room with voices in it, a fire still burning, hands still moving, people still speaking to one another as human beings, and not merely as bodies waiting for the next wave of hunger. Families came together to share their meager meals, yes, but also stories, prayers, small conversations, the familiar rhythm of companionship, and sometimes that mattered almost as much as the food itself. Because when physical survival begins to seem uncertain, the mind reaches desperately for something else to hold. A voice, a ritual, a memory, a neighbor beside you, someone else saying, "We are still here." The knowledge behind these famine foods was never simple. It was complicated, fragile, and often deeply uncertain. What helped one family might harm another. A plant that could be eaten in a small amount might become dangerous in a larger one. A kind of clay that seemed harmless one week might cause terrible pain the next. A soup that soothed one stomach might ruin another. Nothing was entirely stable. Nothing was fully trustworthy, and so families learned in the hardest way possible, through trial, through error, through rumor, through loss. One household might discover a method that made seaweed easier to digest. Another might find that the same method failed them completely. One mother might boil a weed long enough to make it tolerable. Another might not know the difference until it was too late. This was not neat knowledge, not scientific certainty, not recipes written clearly in books. It was survival knowledge, partial, shifting, gathered under pressure, and often purchased at a terrible price. Faith, too, remained in the room, perhaps even more strongly, because when the body is reduced to almost nothing, people often cling harder to what cannot be touched. For many Irish families, religion shaped the way they endured hunger. Some saw their suffering as a test, something sent by God, something that must be borne with patience, with humility, with whatever dignity could still be protected. And so even before clay cakes, even before grass soup, even before a bowl that looked more like sorrow than food, they prayed. Imagine that scene. A family gathered around a poor table, heads bowed, hands folded, a mother whispering grace over a meal made of weeds, a father thanking God for a cake shaped from earth. Not because these things were good, not because they were enough, but because gratitude itself had become a last defense against despair. To pray before such a meal was perhaps a way of saying, we are still human, still a family, still capable of reverence, even here, even now. And yet the psychological cost of eating these strange foods ran deep, deeper perhaps than many could express. Survivors often carried a quiet shame, not rational shame, not deserved shame, but the kind that settles into a person when necessity has pushed them too far from ordinary life. Clay cakes, grass soup, bitter bark bread, these were not simply unpleasant meals. They became symbols of helplessness, of poverty, of the long humiliating distance between what a human being should eat and what famine allows. The taste stayed in memory, so did the texture, the heaviness of clay, the bitterness of boiled weeds, the roughness of bark in the mouth. These things did not disappear when the famine ended. They followed people into later years, into kitchens filled once more with ordinary food, into the silence of a meal where suddenly an old memory returned. The body remembers strange suffering, and food, more than almost anything, has a way of carrying memory with it. Many survivors became incapable of wasting even the smallest scrap. A crust, a peel, a spoonful left at the bottom of a bowl. To others, these were nothing. To them, they were unbearable to discard. Because once you have watched a child cry from hunger, once you have swallowed clay just to quiet an empty stomach, once you have stood in a field gathering weeds for supper, no normal meal ever feels ordinary again. Bread becomes sacred, vegetables become treasure. A full plate becomes something almost too precious to understand. The famine changed not only what people ate, but how they thought about food forever. Many who survived kept emergency stores afterward. Dried seaweed, nibbled seeds of nettles, odd little reserves tucked away against the possibility of another disaster. Not because they wanted to return to those foods, but because they no longer trusted abundance to last. That may be one of famine's most enduring wounds. Even when the cupboard is full, part of the mind still fears the day it may be empty again. And so parents taught their children, and children later taught theirs. Which plants were safe, how to clean seaweed, how to boil nettles, how to recognize what the land might still offer in a hard season. Knowledge that once seemed desperate became inheritance, a dark inheritance, but an inheritance all the same. Medical observation, when it came, confirmed what the starving had already felt in their bodies. Some of these foods could help, briefly. Grass soup and seaweed carried small amounts of vitamins and minerals. Nettles offered genuine nourishment. Tree bark, too, held at least a little value. But none of it was enough on its own. Not enough calories, not enough protein, not enough strength for long survival. And clay. Clay gave almost nothing, only the sensation of fullness, the brief dulling of an empty stomach, and often more suffering afterward. Pain, blockage, sickness, the cruel illusion of relief, followed by harm. The better famine foods were always the ones that contained something real. Seaweed, nettles, tree bark, still harsh, still insufficient, but not entirely false. The worst were the things that merely imitated food, that sat in the stomach without feeding the body, that bought time, but at a terrible cost. And so survival often depended on excess. A family near the shore might gather seaweed. A family near good wild ground might find nettles. A family with only clay and bitter weeds faced far darker odds. Not all desperation was equal, not all hunger had the same chances of mercy. Help from beyond Ireland did come, but unevenly, slowly, and never enough to erase what was already unfolding. Politics clouded compassion. Distance weakened urgency. Prejudice made suffering easier for some to ignore. Aid arrived in some places, but often too late, or too little, or tangled in systems that could not meet the scale of what was happening. And so countless families were left to depend on themselves, on what they could gather, on what they remembered, on what their neighbors knew, on what the land, the shore, and the ditch might still surrender. The famine did not end in a single moment. It receded slowly. As the potato crop began to recover, as other food sources became more available, as the worst edge of the catastrophe loosened. But by then, Ireland had been permanently changed. More than 1 million people had died, not only from starvation itself, but from the diseases that follow when the body has been worn too thin, too long, and another million left. Crossing seas, abandoning homes, fleeing not only hunger, but the memory of it, and the fear that it might come again. The famine had emptied villages, altered families, broken continuities that would never be fully restored, and its food tells that story in the starkest way. Because the survival foods of the Irish famine reveal how quickly a stable world can collapse when too much depends on one crop, one fragile chain, one assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. They also reveal the astonishing ingenuity of people under unbearable pressure. How they searched the shore, the roadside, the hedgerow, the forest. How they learned, shared, adapted. How they tried to pull life out of weeds, out of bark, out of anything at all. But these foods also remind us that not all survival is equal. To avoid immediate starvation is not the same as being nourished. A stomach filled with clay is still a starving stomach. A child fed on bitter weeds is still a child at risk. Food security is not only about calories, it is about real nourishment, strength, health, the ability of a body not merely to continue, but to live. And when people are forced to eat grass, clay, tree bark, and seaweed gathered in desperation, the line between survival and decline becomes terribly thin. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture those Irish families on the coast, waves breaking hard against the rocks, hands cold and wet as they gather seaweed from the shore. Picture them in fields, carefully picking nettles despite the sting, because they know those leaves still hold something their children need. Picture a mother mixing white clay with the last drops of milk, pressing it into the shape of a cake, not because she believes it is food, but because she hopes the shape might make it easier to bear. Their story reminds us that the boundary between food and non-food can blur terribly when hunger grows strong enough. It reminds us how far human beings will go, how much pain they will endure, how much invention they will summon to keep those they love alive. And it reminds us, too, that such ingenuity comes at a cost, physical, emotional, spiritual, so the next time you sit before a meal with fresh vegetables, good bread, or any food that truly nourishes, remember the families who made soup from grass and shaped clay into cakes, because nothing kinder remained. Remember that resilience can be extraordinary, but also terribly expensive. Sleep well tonight, and may your own meals always be richer, safer, and far more merciful than clay cakes and grass soup. Chapter 4: Cactus Candy and Lizard Stew, Desert Survival Foods. Picture yourself standing in the middle of a vast desert. The sun presses down without mercy. The air shimmers. The horizon trembles, and the ground seems to breathe heat back into your face. There are no shops, no farms, no familiar fields of wheat or vegetables, only stone, sand, thorny plants that look hostile, and animals that vanish the moment you notice them. Then night arrives, and the warmth drains away. The temperature drops, the wind turns sharp, and the silence becomes so deep it feels almost physical. What would you eat out here, in a place where most people see only emptiness? What would you put in your mouth when thirst is already tightening your throat and hunger has started to whisper, slowly, persistently, that your body will not last long without something real? This is the story of desert survival foods and of the cultures who learned over centuries to see what others could not, to find nourishment in thorns, sweetness in hard fruit, and life in creatures that look at first glance impossible to catch. In deserts, the difference between wasteland and home is knowledge, because deserts are not empty, not truly. They are complex ecosystems, filled with plants and animals that have adapted to extremes in astonishing ways. Many desert organisms store water, concentrate sugars, preserve nutrients, and protect themselves fiercely. Those protections can look like warnings: spines, tough skins, bitter sap, fast-moving bodies, but behind those defenses, there is often food, sometimes even good food. And perhaps the most famous desert survival plant of all is the prickly pear cactus. At a glance, it seems completely inedible, a plant designed to punish touch. Sharp spines, tiny hairs that cling like invisible needles, a surface that looks as though it was built to say one clear message: stay away. And yet, people did not stay away. Indigenous communities in the deserts of the American Southwest, Mexico, and beyond, learned long ago that beneath those intimidating spines, there was something surprisingly valuable, not just survival food, but real nourishment. The prickly pear offers two kinds of food. First, the flat paddle-shaped segments, often called nopolas, and second, the fruits, small and colorful, called tunas. Both are edible. Both can be genuinely enjoyable, but only if you know what you're doing, because the cactus does not give up its food politely. Harvesting it requires distance, patience, and care. Traditional methods kept hands away from danger. Long wooden tongs, sturdy branches, tools shaped for one purpose: to grip the paddles without touching them. Then came the slow removal of what made them dangerous: scraping, rubbing, burning away spines with controlled heat, not in a hurried way, not carelessly. Because the cactus hides another threat. Tiny hair-like spines, called glochids, smaller than you expect, harder to see, and often worse than the big spines. They cling to skin, work their way in, and leave irritation that can last. So the cleaning had to be thorough. The younger paddles were usually preferred. They carried fewer spines. Their flesh was more tender, less fibrous, less stubborn. Almost surprisingly, like vegetables, older paddles could still be eaten. But they were tougher, more work, a harsher reward. And in the desert, every reward has a cost. Once harvested, the paddles needed careful cleaning. Not just the obvious spines, but every tiny glochid. People used knives, rough stones, even sand, working patiently until the surface was safe enough to handle. Only then could the cactus become food, and it could become many things. Roasted over fire until the flesh softened, until it darkened slightly, until the heat drew out a faint sweetness, boiled into stews, where it could stretch a pot of water and other ingredients. Dried, stored, ground, and yes, sometimes eaten raw, in moments of true desperation when time and fuel were luxuries. The taste could surprise people, often compared to green beans or asparagus, but with a texture that feels unfamiliar, slightly slippery, slightly thick. A reminder that this plant was built for survival, and now it was helping you survive too. The fruits, the tunas, were even more prized, because in a world of dust and heat, sweetness becomes almost magical. They could be yellow, deep red, purple as twilight inside. Seeds surrounded by juicy pulp, flavorful, bright, alive. But the fruits carried their own danger. They too were covered in glochids. Sometimes so fine you wouldn't notice until it was too late. So people developed methods, rolling the fruits in sand or coarse grass to rub away those tiny hairs, carefully peeling the outer skin, revealing the edible interior. Some used brief controlled heat to burn off the glochids. Others learned to cut the fruit open and scoop the pulp, avoiding the spiny surface entirely. All of it slow, all of it deliberate, because the desert rewards care and punishes impatience. And when the fruit was finally safe, when the pulp was finally tasted, it offered something rare. Not only calories, not only hydration, but comfort. A burst of sweetness in a harsh landscape. A reminder that even here, even in a place that looks barren, life has found a way to be generous. The taste of prickly pear fruit often surprises people, because after all those spines, all that caution, all that scraping, all that careful handling, what waits inside is sweetness. Not a harsh desert taste, not bitterness, not something merely tolerable, but something bright, refreshing, almost joyful. Many describe it as something between watermelon and bubblegum. A strange comparison, perhaps, but one that captures the shock of it. Because in a dry and punishing landscape, to bite into a fruit that is cool, sweet, and full of juice must feel almost unreal. And that sweetness is not just pleasure, it is usefulness. The fruit carries vitamin C, natural sugars, and precious water. Exactly the kinds of things a body begins to crave in the desert, because in such places, survival is not threatened only by hunger, but by thirst, by exhaustion, by the slow draining away of strength beneath the sun. A fruit that can help prevent scurvy, that can restore a little sugar to the blood, that can offer moisture when the air itself feels dry enough to crack the skin. That is not just food, that is rescue in plant form. But the prickly pear was only one teacher among many. The desert had other foods too, other secrets, other hard-won gifts. One of the most important was the agave, also called the century plant, or maguey, a dramatic plant, almost sculptural, as if it had been carved rather than grown. Thick leaves, long and blade-like, radiating outward in fierce green rosettes. A plant that seems both beautiful and defensive, something ancient, something patient, because agave does not hurry. It can spend years, sometimes many years, storing energy, holding its strength deep inside itself, waiting, and at the center of the plant, hidden beneath those sharp and powerful leaves, is the heart, the piña, the part most valued as food. Over time, that heart fills itself with carbohydrates, storing up the energy of years. But once again, the desert does not give without demanding knowledge, because an agave cannot be harvested at just any moment. Too early, and the heart will not yet hold enough nourishment. Too late, and the plant will have already spent its stores, pouring its energy into a towering, flowering stalk. So timing matters. Always timing, to harvest agave properly. A person must understand not only the plant, but its age, its stage, its readiness, the kind of knowledge that can only come from watching, from memory, from generations paying attention. And once the heart is cut free, the work has only begun, because raw agave is not yet the food people want. It must be transformed. Traditionally, this meant digging great roasting pits into the earth, lining them with stones, building fires, heating those stones until they held fierce and steady heat. Then the agave hearts were lowered in, set among the hot stones, and buried beneath earth. An underground oven, a hidden fire, a slow act of patience. There, beneath the soil, the agave cooked for days, not hours, days. And in that slow heat, something remarkable happened. The plant changed. Its dense and stubborn carbohydrates broke down into simpler sugars. What had once been tough became soft. What had once been harsh became sweet. And the final taste surprised people just as prickly pear did. Sweet potato molasses, warm earth, smoke. A richness that feels almost impossible for something born in such a severe landscape. The cooked hearts could be eaten at once, shared while still warm, their sweetness earned through labor and time, or they could be preserved, dried, ground into flour, stored for later, because desert life always thinks ahead. A good harvest is not only for today, it must speak to tomorrow as well. Some communities learned to ferment the agave, turning it into alcoholic drinks. Others made syrup, a concentrated sweetness, something to flavor food, something to preserve, something to carry forward into leaner times. So once again, the desert offered not merely survival, but skill, culture, and craft. And then there was the mesquite tree, another quiet master of the dry world. Mesquite does not look dramatic in the way cactus or agave does. It does not announce itself with bright fruit or giant rosettes of blades, but it survives with a different kind of power. Its roots go deep, very deep, down through the hard earth, toward hidden groundwater, toward the secret reservoirs beneath the desert. It knows how to endure heat, how to endure drought, how to remain when other things wither. And in season, it produces pods, long, bean-like pods, plain-looking at first glance, easy to overlook, but inside them, food. Seeds wrapped in a naturally sweet pulp, something dry country people learned to prize deeply. The mesquite harvest mattered so much that whole communities could organize themselves around it, because as with so many desert foods, timing was everything. The pods had to be taken when they were fully ripe, sweet enough, dry enough, ready, but not too late, because once they fell, once they lay too long on the ground, they could rot, spoil, or be lost. So families gathered them carefully, sometimes climbing the trees, sometimes using long poles to shake or knock the pods loose. Then came the slow work of processing, days of it, grinding, sorting, pounding, turning hard desert pods into something softer, something usable, something sustaining. The most common form was flour, mesquite flour, made with stone mortars and pestles, patiently, rhythmically, until the pods and seeds were broken down into meal. And this flour was not only useful, it was good, sweet, nutty, earthy, a flavor with warmth in it. It could be mixed with water, shaped into cakes, stirred into porridge, simple foods, but meaningful ones, because the flower held real nourishment. Protein, complex carbohydrates, minerals, the sort of quiet strength a body needs when living in a place where nothing comes easily. And perhaps that is what makes desert food so remarkable. It is rarely soft in the beginning, rarely obvious, rarely welcoming. It hides behind spines, beneath hard skins, inside roots, within pods that seem too dry to matter. But for those who know how to look, how to wait, how to harvest, how to transform, the desert becomes something else entirely. Not empty, not barren, but stern, secretive, and unexpectedly generous. Mesquite flower had another quiet power. It could last, in the desert that matters, because in a place where harvests depend on rain, and rain is never guaranteed, the ability to store food becomes a kind of safety. Some communities would grind the pods into flour, then seal it away, inside pottery, inside skin containers, inside whatever could keep the dust out and the moisture away. A reserve, something waiting in silence, for the season when nothing else could be found. Because deserts do not only test you with heat, they test you with absence. And when plants are scarce, people look to what moves. Desert survival has always meant learning to see animals differently. Not as distant wildlife, not as background to the landscape, but as potential food, potential strength, potential life. And that is where the story becomes more uncomfortable for many people. Because some of the most available desert animals are the ones most people would never imagine eating. Lizards. They are everywhere in the dry world. Quick shadows on stone, small bodies slipping between rocks, vanishing the moment your attention lands on them. But they are real protein, real nourishment, and in hunger, real nourishment changes what feels acceptable. Catching them is not easy. Desert lizards are built for escape, fast, alert, camouflaged, perfectly matched to the sand and the stone. To catch one requires patience, timing, and a kind of calm focus, the kind of focus that hunger forces upon you. People learned methods, simple, improvised, made from whatever could be found. Small traps, clever placements, quiet waiting. Not dramatic hunting, just careful attention to movement, to habit, to where a creature likes to hide when the sun is at its harshest. And once a lizard was caught, it could become a meal, sometimes roasted, sometimes cooked into stews, depending on what heat, what fuel, what tools were available. Survivors often describe the taste as surprisingly familiar, like chicken or fish, clean, mild, even tender, if prepared well. A strange comfort, to find something that tastes almost normal, in a landscape that feels anything but normal. And then there were the insects, the ones that thrive where almost nothing else does. Grasshoppers, crickets, beetles, small bodies, but dense with nutrients. To some people, the idea feels instinctively wrong. But in many desert cultures, it was never strange. It was practical, because insects can appear in large numbers, seasonally, suddenly. And when they do, they offer a chance, a burst of protein, a concentrated food source, something the land provides in swarms rather than harvests. Preparing them was usually simple, done with heat, done with patience, roasted until dry, until crisp, until the texture changed from soft to brittle, and once cooked, many people found the flavor less frightening than the idea. Nutty, toasted, sometimes compared to popcorn, sometimes something even richer. And in hunger, a food that is light to carry, easy to preserve, can become incredibly valuable. Even plants that look most hostile sometimes offered their gentlest parts. Some cacti bloom, bright flowers opening in the heat, yellow, red, small explosions of color against pale sand. And those flowers, in some places, could be eaten, tender, sometimes surprisingly pleasant. But they were brief, a short window, a season that passes quickly. So gathering them required attention, the ability to notice timing. Because in the desert, so much depends on knowing when something appears and how long it will last. Even these flowers had to be approached carefully. Spines nearby, glaucids hidden in the wrong places. The desert does not stop being dangerous just because it offers something beautiful, Some communities dried flowers for later, saving small pieces of color, small pieces of nutrition for the colder months, when fresh things were harder to find, and beyond flowers, there were seeds, nuts, tiny stores of energy hidden inside dry plants. In the desert, fat matters. It carries strength, it protects the body, it helps endurance. So people learned the value of shrubs and trees that produce dense little packages of fuel. Jojoba, for example, offering nuts that could be eaten, or processed, or turned into valuable oils. Pine nuts in desert mountain regions, rich, nourishing, worth the effort of gathering. Even the smallest seeds from desert grasses, collected patiently, then ground into flour. It is slow work, the kind of work modern people rarely have to imagine. But desert life has never been about speed. It has always been about rhythm, seasonal patterns, rainfall, temperature, bloom, dormancy. Successful survival is not only knowing what can be eaten, it is knowing when it can be found, because deserts shift. A landscape that looks lifeless one month can briefly become abundant after rain, then dry again. So knowledge becomes a calendar in the mind, a map of time, when the fruit comes, when the pods ripen, when the flowers appear, when the insects swarm, and when nothing will be there at all. Water is the shadow behind everything, always. In the desert, thirst is not a discomfort, it is an emergency that grows quietly. But many desert foods carry hidden water. Cactus fruits, cactus paddles, agave hearts, moisture stored inside living bodies, held back from the sun, learning to treat food as hydration. To conserve what little the body receives can become as important as finding a separate water source. And the ways people prepared food were never only about taste. They served survival in multiple layers. Roasting could preserve, drying could store, grinding could make food easier to digest, easier for a stressed body to absorb. Even fermentation, in some traditions, added benefits, supporting digestion when everything else was difficult. And often, the best meals were combinations, because a single desert food rarely offers everything, but together, they can. Carbohydrates from mesquite flour, protein from lizards or insects, vitamins and moisture from cactus fruit, a complete meal, not by luxury, but by balance. A meal designed not to feel full, but to endure. And there is another layer, quieter, but just as real, the psychological one, because learning to eat this way means learning to see the world differently. To look at a lizard and think, food. To look at insects and think, nourishment. To look at a cactus and think, sweetness beneath danger. That shift is not automatic. It asks you to unlearn disgust, to override instinct, to step past cultural conditioning. But people who adapt often say something surprising, that these foods can become enjoyable. Not just tolerable, enjoyable. That the desert, once understood, does not feel like a punishment. It begins to feel like a system, a harsh system, but logical. And traditional desert peoples did not treat harvesting as only a chore. It became culture, ritual, community, mesquite gathering, agave roasting, cactus fruit seasons. These were not only survival strategies, they were social events, moments where knowledge was passed down, older hands teaching younger hands, stories told near fires, timing learned not from books, but from lived seasons. Because knowledge in the desert is inheritance, and sometimes it is medicine too. Many desert foods carried benefits beyond calories. Plants with calming or anti-inflammatory properties, foods that supported digestion, substances that helped the body cope with stress. Not miracles, not guarantees, but small edges, small advantages. And in survival, small advantages matter. So when people speak of cactus candy and lizard stew, it can sound like novelty, like something strange, almost playful. But in the desert, it is older than novelty. It is the quiet intelligence of human beings learning to live, in places where the land does not forgive mistakes, finding sweetness where there are thorns, finding nourishment where there are shadows, finding life where most people see only empty space. Modern research has begun to confirm what desert peoples already knew, not through theory, not through guesswork, but through centuries of living close to the land. Scientists have tested foods like mesquite flour, cactus fruits, desert seeds, and they have found something quietly remarkable. These are not last resort foods at all. Many are genuinely nutritious, rich in minerals, rich in fiber, often carrying stable energy in forms that store well. Some of them are now being cultivated, grown deliberately, packaged, sold far from the deserts that once shaped them. You can find them in health food shops, in markets, in places where people buy them not to survive, but to feel well. It is a strange reversal. A food once gathered under a harsh sun, now chosen under bright store lights, and beyond the foods themselves, there was the intelligence of preservation. Because desert survival is not only about finding food, it is about keeping it. Desert peoples developed storage and preservation methods that were quietly sophisticated. Underground pits, cooler than the open air, steady in temperature, protected from extremes, places where food could rest, safe from heat, safe from sudden spoilage. They learned how to dry foods properly, removing moisture in ways that preserved nutrition, turning fresh harvests into stores that could last months, even years. They made portable preparations, light to carry, dense with energy. Food designed not for comfort, but for distance, for journeys across landscapes where mistakes could be fatal. This was not accidental knowledge. It was refined by generations, by observation, by practice, by memory. And now, as you begin to settle into sleep tonight, imagine the desert at sunset, the fierce heat of the day finally loosening its grip, the sky shifting through gold, into orange, into deepening violet, the air cooling, the wind becoming softer, the horizon still wide, but no longer cruel. Picture a small fire, not roaring, just steady. People gathered around it, sharing food that was earned, roasted cactus paddles, soft and warm, sweet agave hearts, dark mesquite cakes with their nutty flavor, simple meals, but full of meaning. Meals made possible by knowledge, by skill, by respect, because the desert rewards those who treat it correctly, those who learn its rhythms, its seasons, its hidden generosity. The people who made cactus candy and lizard stew were not only surviving, often they were thriving. Not because the desert was easy, but because they understood it. They did not see only emptiness. They saw patterns. They saw timing. They saw where sweetness hides beneath thorns, where nourishment lies behind tough skins, where life waits quietly in roots, pods, seeds, and shade. So the next time you see a desert landscape, in a photograph, in a film, or with your own eyes, remember that what looks like wasteland often is not. It is a living system, complex, subtle, and full of edible possibilities, and the techniques desert peoples developed, the calm creativity, the careful preservation, the patient knowledge of seasons, all of it reminds us of something simple. With enough understanding, human beings can find nourishment almost anywhere, even in places that seem hostile to life. Sleep gently tonight, and may your own meals always be easier, more familiar, and far more convenient. But may you also remember that some of the strangest foods on earth can be surprisingly delicious when prepared by hands that truly know the land. Sweet dreams.